Thank you, thank you. So I'm Marcus, and I grew up here in the West, but I've worked mostly globally, particularly in South Asia, but also Middle East, North Africa, other regions. Very much on water, on climate, and related issues. And I'm incredibly honored to be here with probably one of the sets of people who I found most interesting reading recently. John Ross is a journalist, has written very compellingly on Powell and a lot using Powell sort of as a lens for understanding the West. Patty Limerick is one of the doyens of American water debates here, or in terms of the history here, and an incredibly insightful person on the whole region and the interplay of water and society here. And we're going to structure this as a conversation, really where we're trying to get across a few key points. To me, water is one of those areas when you look at climate that there should be a lot of optimism. There's a huge amount of solutions out there. We are often blocked in doing it for institutional or other reasons, but that there are solutions, and that the history tells us how much of an evolving mosaic it is, the water relationships. And it's not just about top-down control or bottom-up, but there really is a change and a flow in there. And so if there's a takeaway from this session, I think we've all kind of agreed that we'd like to have people take away the idea that change is really possible and that there are places where paradigms have flipped historically. So the way we're going to start this out is by giving each person about 5 minutes to kind of hit a few key points out of their recent writing. We'll start with John on Powell. And if there's anything you want to add to your introduction, do so.
Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a quick show of hands. How many people are familiar with John Wesley Powell? Very good, okay. I can go briefly over that. For those who don't know Powell, most people who do will know that 150 years ago he took quite a remarkable expedition down through the Grand Canyon, on the Colorado through the Grand Canyon, in small wooden rowboats. In 1869, continental America, there was only one kind of small piece of the kind of exploration puzzle that was left open, a 100 by 300 mile section on the Colorado Plateau that encompassed a lot of the things we know called the Grand Canyon, Zion, etc. Native Americans had been certainly in the Grand Canyon, but this was the last kind of white European piece of the puzzle. And Powell, who was a one-armed Illinois school teacher, he lost his right forearm at the Battle of Shiloh in the Civil War, contrived to go down and figure out what the Grand Canyon was all about. So, as I said, 150 years ago, he took 10 months of supplies, including, I just got a kick out of this, a barrel of screws and nails and hammers to build in case they needed to build a cabin to overwinter, right, on the Colorado River. Well, needless to say, they did not need to do that. They ran into all sorts of other problems. Their food got moldy, and they had all sorts of other problems. So they ended up coming out after 3 months, virtually with few clothes on, a couple handfuls of flour yet left. So that's what people tend to know about Powell. It's an incredible adventure story on the surface of it. What I was very interested, and I wrote about, was something that gets kind of obscured sometimes in all of the waves and the drama and the starvation and all that and the death, is that this guy was a geologist, and he went through one of the most extraordinary gashes in the earth. And he talked about it being like reading a book, and the book is the history of the earth. And he went through that. And he had, I wouldn't say it was an epiphany because it didn't happen kind of right away. But something happened as he was going down there, and he could see in the layers of the rock layers as you go down. He could read those, and he saw how much the surface of the earth had changed. Saw volcanic events and inland seas and great kind of movements of the earth that torqued the rock. And he understood that really came to understand that the surface in our lives, the surface of the earth doesn't seem to change, but the fact that the earth is a very fluid, very, very changeable, ongoingly changeable place. So he invented the science of geomorphology. He went on to found the U.S. Geological Survey, set about mapping the United States, became a very, in the late 19th century, a big scientist. But what he began then is really a second part of his career, is he kind of became a visionary about land use and sustainability. Let's see, I have a slide or two here. Let me show him. This is he later on. He was a kind of a grumpy-looking guy. The nerves in his right arm bothered him terribly. This is him at his office at the U.S. Geological Survey. He started coming up with some ideas about looking at the continental United States in an entirely different way. This is a map of a rain climate map and a rain chart. And what he came up with, which was just astounding at the time, so he came up with this whole idea, and you may have heard of it, it's in the title of Wallace Stegner's book about him, but the 100th meridian. And the 100th meridian is a line that runs up kind of from Texas up, and I'll show another slide, going up north towards Canada that goes through up to the Dakotas. And the 100th meridian he picked out was an isohydrate, which is a rain line. Everything generally to the east of that line gets 20 inches or more rain every year. Generally everything, with some exceptions in Pacific Northwest and stuff, to the west of that line gets 20 inches or less of rain. Now what does that mean and why did he pick that? He believed that to be able to farm without additional water in the terms of irrigation, one needed to have at least 20 inches. On the basis of that, he said that we have to entirely look at our development patterns in an entirely new way, right? He said we had been handing out homesteads in the east, 160 acres, quarter section, that if you could till that land, you would get it free. This was the whole idea of the yeoman farmer doing all that. He said suddenly, wait a minute, that's not going to work in the West. There's not enough water, right? What's more, he began to raise the subject about what limited water was going to do in terms of if we did not pay attention to what that did towards development. He started talking about monopolies developing, started talking about kind of ongoing litigation that would happen over limited water. And he really foresaw that a lot of yeoman farmers would really take it in the teeth. So he came up with a lot of ideas. And then this is kind of one of the interesting ones. I kind of think, talking to these guys about that, I thought if Powell had known what a PowerPoint was, he would have been all over it. But he really was really good at taking ideas and translating them into visuals. And this is one of my favorite maps of his. So what you're seeing here is obviously a map of the West. And these things that look like paintball shots on it are watersheds. And his idea was that water should stay in its own watersheds, and that local control within those watersheds, he called them watershed commonwealths. You'll see Over here, the 100th meridian generally, right? The line I was talking about. So this is all the land to the west of that, which is going to be impacted significantly by the location and the about water. And a lot more to say about that. And a lot of his ideas were very idealistic. Watershed commonwealths, have a lot of problems. But what he was really doing was really forcing people for the first time in the United States to look at the map in a different way, not just political boundaries, but to look at climate and to look at what that might mean in terms of how we develop as a nation. And his comment ultimately, I think part of his brilliance really was that he recognized that arid civilizations, it wasn't just about the amount of water available. It was what were the institutions, political, economic institutions that would enable what water there was to be equitably distributed. So, so he was really this very, very kind of disruptive voice when it, in general, the great movement was to go west, young man, and the railroads were going out there, and people were thinking about developing it, and he was saying, wait. And interestingly enough, of course, he got shut badly. He had to quit his directorship at the U.S. Geological Survey because people were gunning from him, because people generally thought he was standing in the way of progress. He would argue otherwise, certainly, but his voice was drowned out. And, of course, you fast forward 30 years after he died to the Dust Bowl, when we didn't pay attention to how our, what we were doing, to the land in terms of cultivating it. And the topsoil blew off, and it caused terrible dislocation. But that's what he was, what he was really beginning to talk about. And so he becomes a very interesting point for talking about climate, how we're thinking about it. This was, of course, in the days before global climate change. But he really began a conversation about that, and is a very interesting kind of point of departure to see where we are today and how we can, how we might be able to change things. But I can talk, but I'll pass it on over.
I mean, one of the things that I find so fascinating in the Powell story, before I pass to you, Patty, in 2 seconds, is simply how much his personal transformation was there as well. From the son of a Methodist preacher, when Methodism and sort of religious foundations were the driving thing, to somebody who really looked at the physical world and the dynamics of that from a geologic perspective, from a hydrologic perspective. And he was at a transformative time in history, and I think we are as well. And so to me, the question of the transformations in thought processes that he was driving is a tremendous insight for now. And Patty, you've got a huge amount of insight on what's happened since then.
I shall now speak of what has happened since then. And that will be 150 years of information. So, but I will keep
Quickly.
the focus on Powell, and I will make several observations about Powell. One of them is that he mystifies me a little bit, because I hadn't really thought about it till you were speaking, but the report on the arid lands, 1870s, by that time, it's clear that states are not going to follow the basin of origin notion. So I myself, when I started working on Denver water, I thought, well, yes, of course, the people who are in the place where the rain falls, they would surely have at least a recognized ethical right to that, but they don't. And prior appropriation was very well established in the territory of Colorado. So I just thought, looking at this, I'm thinking, that was willful. I'm not going to pay attention to what's going on around me. For Powell to say, we'll do this. We'll have the water used in the basins. There's no basin of origin protection by prior appropriation. If you get there first and you claim it, then you have it. So I'm thinking, I kind of admire just I'm going to imagine a West that has no relationship to what is actually happening to water allocation in the West. So I might do that at some point today. I shall imagine a West that has no relationship to reality, and that will be very exhilarating, and I'll float home with that.
I have some comments on
joyful
that.
Experience. So So that would never have occurred to me until just thinking, well, wait, by the 1870s, it's too late for basin of origin, prior moral right or anything like that. Anyway, so 2 or 3 points I want to make really fast, which is that Powell has a split heritage, which is true of, I mean, really, how lucky to just have 2 splits going through your life, which is really quite unified compared to me. So I feel that we are still dealing with the split heritage of John Wesley Powell and will for decades to come. He is, as he lives in our minds, which he does, he is St. Powell of the environmentalists, St. Powell, the advocate of free-flowing rivers, the writer of the canyons of the Colorado, the celebrator of the exhilaration of going on that river. So we have St. Powell of the environmentalists, and we also have St. Powell of the water infrastructure builders and the advocates of storing and diverting water so that not a drop gets wasted and runs into the sea, as Powell hated waste. The notion that water would just be in a channel and would just go pittering down the channel and end up in an ocean, very bad in the Powell mindset, really bad. And just a sign of negligence and inattention and lethargy on the part of human beings to do that. So the fact that that place is called Lake Powell and that he is also St. Powell of the environmentalists, that's his legacy for us. Quite a complicated in some ways, but also just that's what we deal with. Then if you add to that a proliferation of needs and desires focused on water that he could not possibly have seen coming, and there would be no point in saying, how did you miss in-stream flow, Major Powell? It never would have occurred to him to think that a society would, that the American society would evolve to saying some of that water needs to stay in that stream for aesthetic, for recreational economies, for aesthetic purposes, recreational economies, and to preserve endangered aquatic species. He would have thought, now they've gone mad. Keep water in the stream? What could that be for? This was a man who thought that it would probably make a lot of sense to clear cut some forests so that more water would run off and be more available for human use. So he's not good as St. Powell the environmentalist. He could make you storm out of the church, really, in some ways, if you were at the St. Powell service there. And that is what he left us. And it is a wonderful way of organizing our thoughts and navigating in our time to think which of these Powells are we going to be attuned with and how will we factor in these things that came after him. So that's the first one. The second one, which is concealed from me in my notes here, that the second one is about his agrarian preoccupation. This was a person who was Jefferson's protege and descendant, in thinking that very reasonably that you cannot have a democracy, a representative democracy of self-governing people, unless the great majority of those people can support themselves. Because if they are wage workers, they will be subject to oppression and manipulation by the people who pay them those wages. If they are farmers, they can support themselves and they can make their own decisions and they can vote with integrity. So that's not the goofiest idea by a long shot anybody ever came up with. So very agrarian in his preoccupations, and we can see how influential that point of view was, because at this moment, something like 85% of the water in Colorado is allocated to agriculture and to something quite different from municipal and industrial uses. So the extraordinary percentage in most Western states of the water that goes to agriculture, that is a heritage of the late 19th century. So it's very easy to fixate on water use in cities and to say, well, that's a oh, actually, I have a limerick. Oh boy, I have a limerick here. Here it goes. The dry West, this is by me. The West was meant to be dry-o, but we want it to look like Ohio. We are servants to lawns, while to farms we are pawns, and the mournful historian asks, why-o? So that, well, thank you. Thank you. So back to the point here, that to see the preoccupation with green that Americans carried into the West, and to see how early they went at it in Denver, diverting water, planting ornamental shrubbery, planting lawns. It's quite astounding to see what a preoccupation with the color green, and it is hilarious. I hope you'll join me in a round of chuckling here that right at this moment that the environmental movement is called the green movement. In this region, it should be called the olive green movement or the sandy brown movement or something of that sort. So amazing how that lingers. But that whole question about the use of water for agriculture and the state of affairs that we've arrived at, that the beauty of the open spaces that entrances us and charms us, much of that is maintained by irrigated agriculture. The open spaces that are not condos, that invite your eye to cruise over the land and to see it in green, purple waves of grain. Catherine Bates certainly saw what I'm speaking of here. So in many ways, the beauty of the Western landscape comes from the fact that a lot of it is growing alfalfa. So should we want to change the allocation of water, expect a lot more dust. If you de-water farmland, to revegetate that, if you've sat through the presentations where the soil scientists tell you what it takes to revegetate farmland with native vegetation, incredibly expensive and very cumbersome. So there's okay, thanks, Major Powell. We have all these issues that we inherited from you and the dominant use of water for agriculture. In many ways, thank you, Major Powell, for that. That did have some wonderful benefits, but it certainly leaves conundrums now of what do we do with that heritage. And then the third thing is the part that I hope if I have seemed to be, well, I totally agree that Major Powell would have liked PowerPoint. And beyond that, I won't try to think what he would say about today. But I think he would feel sad for us. I guess I'm going to say that. Not so much what he would think, but what he would feel if he registered our mood in this country today. And remember, this is a man who went through the Civil War, so he is not a utopian, let's all do group hug kind of guy. I'm proud to say he did not know the term group hug. That's one of the things I admire and envy about him. I envy him for that. So, though I live with that and deal with that productively. So, in any case, what I want to conclude with in these opening remarks is just his amazing optimism and hope and faith, to go back to his religious upbringing. So I want to read just two quotations from Major Powell that he wrote late in life. And remember, this is the person with the ongoing, never fully resolved pain of his Civil War injury, who had been through some very rough times in political struggle and so on. And this is what he wrote as a man in his early 60s. I'll quote both of them. And I guess I'm going to ask you really quickly, how many of you agree with these sentiments when I finish reading these? The second one in particular. From the dawn of human culture and savagery to the midday of culture and civilization, human genius has been producing many inventions for many purposes, and the good have given place to the better, and the better have yielded to the best. And then particularly ponder this next statement. This is probably going to make me weep. I can't believe this would be true, but it might. Okay. I have faith in my fellow man, towering faith in human endeavor, boundless faith in the genius for invention among mankind, and illimitable faith in the love of justice that forever wells up in the human heart. And it's 2019, and that's, I guess, why my voice is shaking as I read that. How many of you, that you're going to have three choices, I guess. How many of you actually just agree with Powell in that last statement about his faith in humans? How many of you wish you could agree with Powell on that? And how many of you just think, oh, to be so naive, what a unrealistic person. How could he do that? Anyone want to just go for how could he possibly have gotten there? And I cut off anybody who wanted to say that they fully believed in his, apparently I didn't cut anybody off. So what do you know? Woohoo! And I know that person. I used to spend a lot of time with her, and now I'm going to spend days with her. And she's going to, wherever she goes, Juana's going to have me with her now. That's really good. What a spirit. I know you have a great spirit. So those are the terms. If anybody here on Tuesday night, if you're in Loveland, Paolo Bacigalupi and I are going to be on a panel together. He is the author of The Water Knife, which is the darkest portrait of what could happen to us in the future. There's an enormous amount of sex in it, we'll just say that. That novel is really compelling, and that's what, if we're gonna have somebody who's gonna do John Wesley Powell for our times, with the crisis of our times, he needs to look at that book, she needs to look at that book and put a lot of sex in, because that is very important for getting wide readership in the 21st century. But it is an incredibly dark view of our future, and it is darker than anything I would actually be able to take up. And I'm totally glad that he and I will be on a panel at the I think it's at the Loveland Library on Tuesday. I can get you more stuff on that if you want to see me. And I will look like John Wesley Powell in my hopefulness compared to him, I suspect, which will be a good thing. And Juan is coming with me so that she can keep me cheered up. There, that'll be that. So, okay, those are my opening remarks.
I mean, when I think of this, I just go, the story that's coming out of the West is similar to the story in so many other parts of the world. I mean, when I look in India, the tremendous water scarcity in the cities that's currently being experienced on a day-to-day basis, the allocation of water between agriculture and urban areas, and also this question of, I think, optimism versus pessimism that is there, of the sense that, you look at a lot of the friends I grew up with, we're tremendously optimistic about the ability to clean water in the Bagmati, the ability to address some of the tremendous groundwater overdraft issues, the question of supplying water to people. And yet the practical realities has been just this huge growth and incredible intensification. And, as we joke here, water's a bipolar molecule. It flows uphill towards money when there's too little of it, and it flows downhill away from money when there's too much of it. It kind of hits that. And so, to me, when I look at Powell and I look at that divided legacy, there's this tremendous message of optimism, innovation, in some cases by engineering. It's had tremendous unintended consequences. And the question to me that I would pose to John and Patty both is, where do you see kind of that balance between innovation and excitement, new ideas and transformation, and where do you see it as really stuck, that we've built ourselves infrastructure, patterns of growth, and other things that create really kind of hard to change patterns? And are there points of entry where we can move away from simplistic solutions to things that actually begin to move the needle on some of the issues that are happening? Out of Powell's ideas or out of others? And we only have 10 minutes before questions.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
I think the whole idea of American optimism that has just run through our culture and our identity, has led, is a double-edged sword, of course. It's been the product of, it's caused some of our greatest accomplishments, and it's been our Achilles heel. So, it's not a black and white thing. And and also we're dealing with this whole thing too, the whole people who believe that we can work our way out of our problems through our ingenuity and our, inventing things, versus people who don't think that that is going to, be possible. Gets very complicated with global climate change because the stakes are so huge. So I guess I come from it too, that looking at Powell, I think so many of kind of the things that were kind of stymieing him. And again, saint and sinner, he certainly was a complex human being and certainly a man of his time. So we don't want to attribute too much of, what we are sitting here today thinking about to him. But I think we do need disruptors, and he was an ideal example of that. He was, we do need people who can, disrupt and allow us to take really, really new looks at what is going on around us. And that takes a kind of a leap that kind of takes an imagination. I mean, Powell had a really amazing kind of imagination. And it's those kinds of things I think that are important to kind of think about today. Where is that coming from, and how can we talk about
How can we leverage the imagination? I mean, Patty, you've talked about the double-edged sword of engineering and engineers as innovators.
Yeah. So I guess I would say 3 or 4 things fast. That what seldom comes up in these discussions, I'm sorry to say, in the mainstream, is the important thing called winners' rights, which are the guaranteed reserved rights for Indian reservations, American Indian reservations, and those have never been it's from a Supreme Court decision in 1908, the Winters decision. Those I don't think are fully implemented in any way now, and that could really be a game changer thing. And to be led by tribal folks on that, I think would be great. So, and Powell was interested in Indians, but he was an assimilation kind of guy, I think, and he really never had that notion that they might still be here and they might have the Native American Rights Fund a few blocks away pushing for Winters' rights. So I just wanted to say that. I do want to say that I am tired of dualities and polarities and constructions of opposition and polarization. Rural and urban places in Colorado are so intertwined in their well-being. The attraction of living in Denver is so much about the access to open spaces in rural areas, and so to pit these two as if they were opposites, I understand how that can happen in water issues, but it's 2% of the state's water supports 25% of the people through Denver water. That's interesting. That's an interesting percentage and something just to think about. What if we had even greater density in Denver and so on? There's just interesting ways not to go oppositional, but to see, in fact, a symbiotic and synthesizing relationship. So I have a limerick on that, which is rural and urban places have never been opposite cases. They're like sister and brother. They depend on each other. They are tied together like laces. So that's, well, thank you. Thanks. It is interesting. I don't know why I don't just speak entirely in limericks. They're so popular.
You and my grandfather would have gotten along excellently.
Well, and you write
Everything
them.
was
You
in
write them.
limerick.
You write them. And he wrote an essay about the origins of the limerick that he's going to send to all of us. So this is totally important. I'm glad that came up. So moving along, the last thing I wanted to mention is, or two more things, that we do have quite a number of things for the last 30 or more years of watershed coalitions. Yes, we have appropriation. Yes, we have rather inflexible senior and junior rights, and we have endless numbers of these people drinking coffee and eating donuts and getting together to talk about collaborative decision making. The stupid phrase that's always used at water conferences, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. Supposedly the Mark Twain papers people can't find any evidence that Twain said it. There's good evidence for that because it's not particularly witty, and usually Twain would say something witty. Whiskey is for drinking, that's stipulated, but water is for fighting, sometimes no. Sometimes water, this is my rewrite of the phrase, of the sentence that Twain never said. Whiskey is for drinking. Water is for brewing coffee to be served at stakeholder meetings and watershed coalitions. So that's, then the last item I wanted to mention was, and that, that's a very hopeful notion of these collaborative decision makings. I wanted to say something about engineers, that for the better part of a century in what I call the era of improbable comfort made possible by a truly astonishing but taken for granted infrastructure. That should be becoming a household phrase, and it only takes 4 tries, and then you can say it very comfortably. So anyway, that whole relationship between engineers who produced that astonishing infrastructure and got Americans in the West so used to, we just turn on the faucet. That's what we do. We do that. Total comfort, whether it's showers or outdoor irrigation, we just do that. Engineers made that possible. The agreement between society and engineers is not healthy. It's the society saying to the engineers, you will get us commodities and resources and services whenever we want them. That will be reliable, that will be cheap, and if you ever make a mess, we'll be very angry. Very angry if you disrupt any locale in order to produce those resources. So that's got to change. We have to have a better relationship because the ingenuity of engineers is crucial to whatever we do productively in adapting to climate change. So I will finish with my tribute to engineers in limerick form. Though we would never want to be catty, engineers have made nature ratty. As they fill all our needs, we bombard them with screeds, which for some reason drives them all batty.
So, I think the beauty of engineering is, here we get all this fresh water rolling out of a pipe, and we get to shit in Champagne, and it goes down and it's diverted into the city. We shit it goes out, and then the fish jump higher because they all have extra caffeine in their blood and extra hormones and that sort of thing. But the point in that, too, is engineers designed that urban sanitation system. There's a mental framework, much like the Methodist framework, that cleanliness is water. There are other ways of having sanitation which require engineering to happen and are often blocked by regulatory things, but we don't have to have that paradigm. And you could change a lot of the water impacts by just a mindset change that would lead to an engineering change, and you'd need that dialogue. We only have a few minutes left before we need to open for comments. Do you have some key thoughts here as well on that, or should we just hop to comments and questions?
I'd be kind of interested on questions, yeah.
Okay. Bear.
Questions. Please keep them short, if you can.
I've heard it claimed, one of our concerns you hear about a lot is rising ocean levels. And I've heard it claimed that a big contributor to that, beyond all the melting ice caps and all that, is what you were just alluding to, the way that our urban systems deal with wastewater, so-called wastewater, stormwater runoff. I mean, we basically have designed all these elaborate ways to get rid of water and send it into the oceans, and that's actually a contributor. Any comments on that?
I guess I'm not quite following that, because before the era of improbable comfort, the waters just went into the ocean, and I don't know that that was ever thought of as anything but a hydrologic cycle, and maybe something. Obviously, the hydrologic cycle is not what it was. So, but it seems like it would be just not quantitatively significant in comparison to melting glaciers. But couldn't I just remember for myself just now, I'm going to talk to myself, that remember, you're in the humanities, Patty, so just back off on that one. I don't know if that was really...
Do you have any insights on that? I mean, my own reaction would be similar to Patty's, in that most of the problems I've run into are rivers no longer running to the ocean, that it's being used and evaporated higher up the stream. In many places I've worked, the last 150 miles of rivers just doesn't exist. But I think that there is a point that when you pull water out of an upstream area, you're always depositing it into a downstream area. And that in that process, you're leaving large sections of rivers basically running on effluent. And I don't think it adds, I don't know if it changes things quantitatively in terms of sea level rise. I don't know if there's other questions.
So what about our giant reservoirs that we have in along the Colorado River system that are now failing to be full and silting up, et cetera? What do you see for the future of all these creations we put together in the 30s, 40s, 50s?
And as we're drilling further and further down into the aquifers, yeah. I don't know. This is a big question, but not good.
Well, I guess, oh, sorry, go ahead, please. I guess this is sort of is your glass half full or is your glass half empty applied to reservoirs? So yes, they are drawn down, significantly drawn down, and Lake Mead, they have to keep putting a lower intake in there, but they're still there, and there's nothing much. I mean, Edward Abbey's great masculine fantasies were, we'll just take them out, which would if you've hung out with with a geomorphologist, you know that if you just take them out, you don't just restore the river as it was. You don't just have them. But that's the kind of fantasy, is get those things out of there. Well, they're there, and they are half functioning at least, maybe a little bit more than half, which is better than not functioning at all or being entirely silted up and so on. So I think they are to be lived with ingenuity. I don't know anything else that we could do that would be anything but time wasting and leave posterity more troubled than posterity's already going to be on that. So I think I'm coming up more and more with myself of just going, deal with it is the thing to do, and to dream of a place where the rivers flowed free and should have, and if we hadn't had this agrarian preoccupation, we would be, I don't know where that gets us. I've decided I actually have a political category. I didn't realize I did until 2 days ago, and my category is a utopian pragmatist. which is that I am not really interested in dreaming of things that we couldn't possibly do, but I'm really interested in believing that if we are pragmatic, we actually move closer to the idealistic goals. And so that is, would anyone like to join my party? This is,
Yeah.
this is the first public mention of my exciting new political identity, because I did not have one until Saturday, what's today? Friday, I got this. So we need we need a candidate, I guess. I don't know. We need someone to run for president. I think that's probably true. So anyway, I think this is a classic opportunity for utopian pragmatism. The pulse, when the Bureau of Reclamation a few years ago released that major pulse that reached the Sea of Cortez and gave people a vision of what it was to have water in that river all the way through. And Mexico is a big depleter of that river as well as the U.S. Anyway, that pulse was an amazing thing. Ann Castle, who was Assistant Secretary of the Interior, who was the main decision maker on that, she lives here. She lives she teaches it at the law school. So let us put Ann Castle on our shoulders and carry her around and have that as our first rally of the utopian pragmatists to say, here's Ann Castle. So she dealt with those dams, but in such a different and creative way. So maybe she will be our presidential candidate.
Yeah.
It'd be really good too.
As a founding allocate of the utopian pragmatists, one of the pieces that I think of it is to recognize that a lot of the reservoirs are big evaporation ponds, and that one of our biggest issues is salt and the accumulation of salts from evaporation. And that one of the ways to move forward, and I think this is where the glass half full, the glass half empty kinds of things, that there are strategies, move towards storing more of our water in groundwater. You lose far less to evaporation, you have more seepage into the rivers for that to be flowing. That will reduce your reliance on the dams and your ability to open things up more. But what we have right now often is good dams, bad dams, rather than, an opposition, rather than a path. And I think that that's where the utopian pragmatist kind of notion, how do we get that path? And where is that path? And that's a path that does require engineering as well.
Right. And just a quick Powell question. My sense is that we have been so preoccupied with precipitation and its distribution in the West that we have not really talked about ET. And evaporation transpiration that's another reason we have all the sunlight. Woohoo, we have all the sunlight. And that's the bad news for evaporation. So, and I don't know about Major Powell. Was he thinking about ET, which of course now just means that little lizardy creature who came from outer space, ET, but...
He did mention, he was talking about it. I don't know how accurate some of his measurements of that, were, but he certainly totally underestimated the amount of underwater, aquifer water there was. And he was talking about dams. He was talking about 6-foot dams, not many hundreds of feet high. I don't know. I also get a sense that Powell has, as a scientist, he was really one for talking about gathering data, stream gauge data, all sorts of, mapping things, putting things all together. Whether he believed that was the be-all and end-all, I don't know. Putting your faith in science. But there's been a lot of people are still so kind of reactionary when it comes to talking about numbers and statistics and what's on the ground. And I'm kind of curious on what you guys think about why there's still such strong backlash against the human, caused global climate change. Because I think Powell, if he was here, would have been saying,
Right.
oh my God, he would be doing new maps.
Well, right. And among ourselves, we have spoken about let's just say that science is really important. University of Colorado is so noted because of the scientists on campus. And the federal labs are really important. So I'm going to say all that, and now I'm going to pick on scientists. So in the 19th century, the best writers about the American West, with an occasional exception, the best writers in terms of quality of language, of effectiveness in reaching audiences, the best writers were naturalists and scientists. in the 19th century West, Powell being one of them. And he was sort of bilingual. He could write the policy speak thing effectively, but he could also write the adventure in the canyon stuff. So are scientists the best writers about the American West today? No. They are publishing, because their career requirements are that, they're publishing in academic journals, and they are writing, with an occasional exception, but they are writing in a manner that could not possibly engage, invite, encourage their audiences to think about their work. And so if we could encourage scientists to recapture this spectacular heritage from the 19th century West, and to come work with some of us who pay more attention to reaching audiences with our use of language, if we could persuade them into that, then I think we could run a whole other experiment on communications about climate change. I think there was an understandable dream on the part of scientists. We're experts, we've done this data, people will respect experts, we'll go out, we'll convey this to the public, they'll accept it, they'll take our lead. And it's so much more complicated, but it's also so much more satisfying and exhilarating to try to think, how do we get this expressed in a form that will matter? So in my judgment, that's one of the things that has to happen now, is we have to have scientists repossess the spectacular heritage of their profession from the 19th century, and to take joy and pleasure in doing that.
So in essence, inculcate more scientists into the JLF. Let's get back to some questions if we still have time for one or two more.
Patty, a little bit of a local question, but where do you stand on expanding the Gross Reservoir?
I did write a book about Denver water. I am not a hack or an apologist there. I believe I know the reasons for why they want to do that. I believe they want to do that because the the fires in 2002 were very disruptive, sediment, and all kinds of troubles occurred to Cheeseman Dam. 80% of the supply of Denver comes through the southern system, including Cheeseman Dam. Those fires in 2002 made the Denver water people very nervous about what would happen with 80% of their supply coming through one part of the system. So expanding the northern delivery system seemed the only way to be prepared for well, I guess, how do you prepare for an unforeseen calamity? But it was very precarious, the way it was. So I believe that they had reasons for wanting to increase the supply through the northern system, which is what the Gross Dam would be. Well, and I should also say that the idea of expanding Gross Dam, raising Gross Dam and expanding the reservoir, that came out of the fights over Two Forks in the 1980s. And that was proposed by environmentalists who said, rather than put a whole new dam in for Two Forks, take an existing disrupted river system and expand that. So it is a little ironic and paradoxical that it came from environmentalists. So I also believe that the negotiations with the Western Slope people to reconfigure the river on the Western Slope to make it deeper and therefore cooler and less punitive, I believe that was done in good faith with Trout Unlimited, with a bunch of negotiators on that. And I also believe that the framework of saying that, sorry, I should have said, actually I don't know anything, so I should have, but I do believe that the framework of negotiation with the Western Slope and the agreement that there will be no more trans-basin diversions without the full participation and consent of the Western Slope institutional entities, I think that's really different. As to whether people want to join me in that or not, I can see why the neighbors are very disturbed, because it's going to be a lot of construction, it's going to be trucks and dust, and they didn't move there. Many of them get by on groundwater, that's a paradox, so.
So I'm going to go from the very local to the international, because I recognize I live in the arid West, and I remember the time several years ago when I couldn't water my garden every day. It was a struggle. But I go to India and I see the water crisis there. We have potable water. We can flush our toilets. They cannot even do that. There is this residential community in Delhi called Vasant Kunj, which houses about 2 million people, and they have trucks coming in with water every day. So I think the next great challenge for the world is really the availability of clean potable water. People will die without this. We can do without oil, but we cannot do without water. So this is not a question, it's just a lament.
But I think it's also one to reflect on in terms of transformation and how we assume water comes. Because people know, I've done a lot in India and other areas. In places in Yemen where I've worked, water was coming once every 45 days. When they put in piped water systems, people went from 20 liters per capita per day to 180 gallons per capita per day in Yemen. They went through the Sana'a aquifer, which was projected to be 1,000 years of supply in 10. Okay? So our assumption that water comes out of the tap and that we can shit in champagne is a mental frame. If you look at it, what we need for drinking and bathing is far less. And one of the effective measures of water supply is how much we pollute it. So if we can reframe things and to make sure that we don't shit in champagne or use a grinder and dump plastic down it or dump our medicines in it or use it for washing cars and all sorts of things like that, that really add toxic loads that we can't treat, then the amount of water is much higher. And if we get away from the idea that water comes out of a tap and that the pipe is underground where out of sight, out of mind, all big pipes leak. In places I've been, they were running pipes at the first floor level so you could see when it dripped on your head. That's the same reason people gave me for why the Roman aqueducts are still running in areas. It's over there. When it leaks, you put some cement up on it. And when it's underground, it doesn't. So I think there's a place of reframing that offers tremendous opportunity. And that places like Delhi or places like Ahmedabad or places like Chennai, other places, Sana'a, Taiz, others, wouldn't actually be short of water if we reframed our conceptions about how it's built. And that's one of the pieces where I'm optimistic, as not that we have a societal movement to do that, but that we have the opportunity to do it. So.
I would say absolutely keep those international comparisons in our mind. Cape Town coming right to the edge of zero on that. And then I would also say that I am much less regionalist in my orientation now, because in many parts of the eastern U.S., they have replicated Western-like water shortages through issues of water quality. So places where there's plenty of precip have ended up in compromised situations. And so no one should ever have a conversation about water without mentioning Flint, Michigan. And nobody should mention nobody does mention that there was a lot of back and forth. EPA, this region, Region 8, had engineers coming very attuned to Western water issues. They were working in Flint. So, and that wasn't in the news. I don't think anybody ever particularly noticed that, but there is recognition on the part of the water managing people that we had better get out of this. Well, we're just talking about ourselves. Sorry, Major Powell. Yes, by all means, think locally. It's all good. But we're going to screw up locally if we're not thinking in these larger dimensions. And really, back to your point, how fortunate we are in our circumstances.
We've been signaled that the time is up, and I'm really glad, Patty, that you've provided me with optimism. When I think of Flint, I'm really glad we've learned from the Romans. The lead in the pipes was the same issue going way back, and it's taken us so long to internalize. That's my point. Yeah, but I think we're out of time.
You can close if you like a minute.
Yeah, I think that you.
No. I'm just enjoying this because, I am really an amateur about kind of water today, but I just see this incredible lead up to the questions where we come up from Pal, and I can't say I'm heartened at the moment. I'm just, I'm not heartened at the moment.
I'm not heartened in terms of the directions. I'm heartened in terms of the opportunities. That there are actually things we can do, and I think it's about 1,001% solutions. It's not grand designs. It's about the aggregation and the building up of a different paradigm. The question of whether we have the will, whether at the local level or the political level, is different. But I think that when I listen to my kids, they are tremendous pessimists and scared about things. I think there's a key thing to actually say, there have been transformations before. We can make those transformations. Patty, you?
Well, I had another limerick.
Oh, that's a good way to...
Oh, that's a
Which,
good way to end.
Is not good as a concluding thing. I think it's very fresh. It was written very recently. Oh, no, where'd it go? Okay, this is called America Today. And I don't think this is a condition, the concluding lines, this is a condition we choose. I don't think we have to choose these conditions. I think we could choose very different ones. I was on a forum in Salinas, California on whether Americans have ever gotten along, and this was the limerick from that. The art of getting along makes some nations healthy and strong, but our nation fights, it snarls and bites and staggers between right and wrong.
Thank you.
And it does, just to accent, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
Thank you. Obviously, this is a conversation that needs to keep going. Thank you to Patty Limerick, Marcus Moench, and John Ross.